everybody. Today, Honey is going to read Matilda by Ronald Dahl and illustrated by Quentin Blake. Chapter 15. The Second Miracle. Matilda did not join the rush to get out of the classroom. After the other children had all disappeared, she remained at her desk, quiet and thoughtful. She knew she had to tell somebody what had happened with the glass. She couldn't possibly keep a gigantic secret like that bottled up inside her. What she needed was just one person, one wise and sympathetic grown-up who could help her to understand the meaning of this extraordinary happening. Neither her mother or her father would be any of use at all. If they believed her story, and it was doubtful they almost certainly would fail to realize that an astounding event it was that had taken the place in the classroom that afternoon. On the spur of the moment, Matilda decided that one person she would like to confide was Miss Honey. Matilda and Miss Honey were now the only two left in the classroom. Miss Honey had seated herself at a table and was riffling through some papers. She looked up and said, "Well, Matilda, aren't you going outside with the others?" Matilda said, "Please, may I talk to you for a moment?" "Of course you may. What's troubling you?" "Something very particular had happened to me, Miss Honey." Miss Honey became instantly alert. Ever since the two disastrous meetings she had recently about Matilda, the first with the headmistress and the second with the dreadful Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, Miss Honey had been thinking a great deal about this child and wondering how she could help her. And now, here was Matilda sitting in the classroom with a curiously exalted look on her face and asking if she could have a private talk. Miss Honey had never seen her looking so wide-eyed and particular before. "Yes, Matilda," she said. "Tell me what had happened to you that is so peculiar." "Miss Honey isn't going to expel me. Miss Trunchbull isn't going to expel me, is she?" Matilda asked. Because it wasn't me who put that creature in the jug of water. I promise you it wasn't." "I know it wasn't," Miss Honey said. "Am I going to be expelled?" "I think not," Miss Honey said. "The headmistress simply got a little overexcited. That's all." "Good," Matilda said. "But that isn't what I want to talk to you about." "What do you want to talk to me about, Matilda?" "I want to talk to you about the glass of water with the creature in it," Matilda said. "You saw it spilling all over Miss Trunchbull, didn't you?" "I did indeed." "Well, Miss Honey, I didn't touch it. I never went near it." "I know you didn't," Miss Honey said. "You heard me telling the headmistress that it couldn't possibly have been you." "Ah, but it was me, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "That's exactly what I want to talk to you about." Miss Honey paused and looked carefully at the child. I don't think I quite follow you," she said. "I got so angry at being accused by something I hadn't done, I made it happen." You made it that what happened, Matilda?" "I made the glass tip over." "I still don't quite understand what you mean," Miss Honey said gently. "I did it with my eyes," Matilda said. "I was staring at it and wishing to tip, and then my eyes went all hot and funny, and some sort of power came out of them, and the jug just toppled over." Miss Honey continued to look steadily at Matilda through her steel-rimmed spectacles, and Matilda looked back at her just as steadily. "I'm still not following you," Miss Honey said. "Do you mean you actually willed the glass to tip over?" "Yes," Matilda said, "with my eyes." Miss Honey was silent for a moment. She did not think Matilda was meaning to tell a lie. It was more likely that she simply allowing her vivid imagination to run away with her. "You mean you're sitting where you are now, and you told the glass to topple over, and it did? Something like that, Miss Honey. Yes. If you did that, then it should just about the greatest miracle a person had ever performed since the time of Jesus. I did it, Miss Honey. It is extraordinary, said Miss Honey, how often small child have flash of fancy like this. She decided to put an end to it as gently as possible. Could you do it again? She asked, not unkindly. I don't know, Matilda said, but I think I might be able to. Miss Honey moved the now empty glass to the middle of the table. Should I put water in it? She asked, smiling a little. I don't think it matters, Matilda said. Very well then, go ahead and tip it over. It may take some time. Take all the time you want, Miss Honey said. I'm in no hurry. Matilda, sitting in the second row and 10 feet away from Miss Honey, put her elbows on the desk and cupped her face in her hands, and this time she gave the order right at the beginning. Tip, glass, tip, she ordered, but the lips didn't move and she made no sound. She simply shouted the words inside her head. And now she concentrated the whole of her mind and her brain and her will up to her eyes, and once again, but much more quickly than before, she felt the electricity gathering, and the power was beginning to surge, and the hotness was coming into the eyeballs. And then the millions of tiny invisible arms and hands on them were shooting out towards the glass, and inside her head for the glass to go over. And without making any sound at all, she kept on shouting inside her head for the glass to go over. She saw it wobble, then it tilted, then it toppled right over and fall like a tinkle on the tabletop, not 12 inches from Miss Honey's folded arms. Miss Honey's mouth dropped open and her eyes stretched so wide you could see the whiteness all around. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The shock of seeing the miracle performed had struck her dumb. She gazed at the glass, leaning well away from it now, and as though it might be a dangerous thing, and slowly she lifted her head and looked at Matilda. She saw the child white in the face, as white as a paper. Trembling all over, the eyes gazed, staring straight ahead and seeing nothing. The whole face was transfigured, and the eyes round and bright, but she was sitting there speechless, quite beautifully in a blaze of silence. Miss Honey waited, trembling a little herself and watching the child as she slowly stirred herself back into consciousness. And then suddenly, click, went her face into a look of most seraphic calm. I'm all right, she said and smiled. I'm quite all right, Miss Honey, so don't be alarmed. You seem so far away, Miss Honey whispered, awestruck. Oh, I was. I'm flying fast as stars on silver wings, Matilda said. It was wonderful. Miss Honey was still gazing at the child in absolute wonderment, as though she was the creation, the beginning of the world, the first morning. It was much quicker this time, Matilda said quietly. It's not possible, Miss Honey was gasping. I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. She closed her eyes and kept on them closed for quite a while, and when she opened them again, it seemed as though she had gathered herself together. Would you like to come back to and have tea at my cottage? She asked. Oh, I'd love to, Matilda said. Good. Gather up your things and I'll meet you outside in a couple of minutes. You won't tell anyone about this thing that I did, will you, Miss Honey? I wouldn't dream of it, Miss Honey said. Chapter 16. Miss Honey's Cottage. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gate, and the two of them walked in silence through the village's high street. They passed a greengrocer with the window full of apples and oranges, and the butcher with his bloody lumps of meat on display and naked chickens hanging up, and the small bank, and the grocery store and the electric shop, and then they came out at the other side of the village on to the narrow country road where there are no people anymore and very few motor cars. And now that they were alone, Matilda all of a sudden became wildly animated. It seemed as though a value had burst inside her, and a great rush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey with wild little hops, and her fingers flew as she would scatter them to the four winds, and her words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey this, and Miss Honey that, and Miss Honey I do honestly feel I could move almost anything in the world, not just toppling over glasses and little things like that. I feel I could topple tables and chairs, Miss Honey, even though when people are sitting in the chairs, I think I could push them over, and bigger things too, much bigger than chairs and tables. Only I'd have take to a moment and get my eyes strong, and I can push it out, this strongness, and anything at all, so long as I'm staring at it hard enough. I have to stare it very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard. Then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes. And my eyes got hot just as though they were burning, and I don't mind that in the least, Miss Honey. Calm yourself down, child. Calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let us get ourselves too worked up so early in the proceedings. But do you think it is interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it is interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It is more than interesting, but we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why must we treat carefully, Miss Honey? Because we are playing with with mysterious forces, my child, that we know nothing about. I don't think they are evil. They may be good. They may be even divine. But whenever they are or not, let us handle them carefully. There were wise words from a wise old bird. But Matilda was too stand up to see it that way. I don't think why we have to be so careful, she said, still hopping about. I'm trying to explain to you, Miss Honey said patiently, that we are dealing with the unknown. It is an unexplainable thing. The right word for it is a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon. Am I a phenomenon? Matilda asked. It is quite possible that you are, Miss Honey said, but rather you don't think of us yourself as anything in particular at this moment. What I thought we might do is explore the pantheon a little further, just two of us together, but making sure we take things very carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of it then, Miss Honey? That is what I'm tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said cautiously. Goody good, Matilda said. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bowled over that you did than you are, and I am trying to find a more reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you are quite exceptionally precocious. What exactly does the word mean? Matilda said. A precious child, Miss Honey said, is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You're an unbelievably precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of confidence and self-consciousness. I can't help wondering, she said, whether this sudden ability had come to you, of being able to move an object without touching it, whether it might have something to do with your brain power. You mean there is not be room on my head for all those brains, so something has to push out? That's not quite what I mean, Miss Honey said, smiling. But when whatever happens, and I say it again, we must treat carefully from now on. I have not forgotten the strange, distant glimmer on your face after you tipped over the last glass. Do you think doing it could actually hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? You made me feel pretty peculiar, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment I was flying past the stars on silver wings. I told you that. But shall I tell you something else, Miss Honey? It was easier the second time. Much, much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking slowly so that small child could keep up with her without trotting too fast. and it was very peaceful out there in the narrow road. Now that the village was behind them, it was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there was blackberries and splashes old man's beard on the hedges. The hot sunberries were ripening scarlet for the birds, and the cold winter came along. There was tall trees here and there on either side, oak and sycamore and ash, and occasionally a sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject for a moment, gave the names of these to Matilda and taught her how to recognize them by the shape of their leaves and the pattern of the bark on their trunks. Matilda took all this in and stored the loaded away carefully in her mind. They came finally a gap into the hedge of the hand side of the road, and where there was a 5-barred gate. "This way," Miss Honey said, and she opened the gate and let Matilda through and closed it again. They were now showing along a narrow lane that was no more than a rooted cart track. There was a high hedge of hazel on either side, and you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts in their green jackets. "The squirrels will be collecting them all very soon," Miss Honey said, and storing them away carefully for the bright month ahead. "You mean you live down here?" Matilda asked. "I do," Miss Honey replied, but she said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She had always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught and schooled, then went away again. Do any of the children, she wondered, ever stop to ask herself where teachers go when the school is over for the day? Do we wonder if they live alone, or there's a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? "Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Honey said, "very much so." They were walking over deep sunk-bed mud tracks on the lake, and you had watched as you put your feet if you can twist your ankle. There was a few small birds around the hazel branches. That was all. "It's just Farm Rebel's cottage," Miss Honey said. "You mustn't expect too much of it. We're nearly there." They came to a small green gate half buried in the hedge on the right and almost hidden by the overhanging hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, "There it is. That's where I live." Matilda saw a narrow pathway leading to a tiny red brick cottage. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human dwelling. The bricks it was built of were old and crumbly and pale red. It was grey slate roof and one small chimney, and there was two little windows at the front. Each window was no larger than a sheet of tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. Or either side to the path where the wilderness of nettles and oak trees stood overshadowing the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to be enfolding and embracing the tiny building, and perhaps hiding it as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which she had not yet opened, turned to Matilda and said, "I think a poet called Daniel Thomas once wrote some lines that I think very much every time I walk up this path." Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful slow voice, began reciting the poem. "Never and never, my girl riding far and near, in the land of hearthstone tales and spelled asleep. Fair or believe that the wolf in the sheep-white hood, loping and bleeding roughly and fleetly shall live. My dear, out of a lair of flock lives in the dew-dipped ear, to eat your heart in the house in the rosy wood." And there was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never been heard the great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. "It's like music," she whispered. "It's music," Miss Honey said, and then, as though embarrassed at having revealed a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked to the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic and so totally away from this world. It was like an illustration of Grimm or Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel and the Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the seven dwarfs and the three bears and the rest of them. It was straight out of the fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in that what seemed to be dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through the kitchen and help me make the tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That, if you could call it a kitchen, it was not much bigger than a good-sized closet cupboard. There was one small window at the back wall and a sink under the window, but there was no taps over the sink. Against another wall there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself stood Primus stove, a saucepan, and a half-full bottle of milk. A Primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin, and you light it at the top and you pump it to get pressure for the flame. "You can get me some water while I light the Primus," Miss Honey said. "The well is out at the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll have a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket on the end of the rope and lower it down. But don't throw in yourself." Matilda, more bruised than ever now, took the bucket and carried it out into the back garden. The wall had a little wooden roof over it and a simple lighting device, and there was the rope dangling down to the dark bottomless hole. Matilda pulled the rope and hooked the handle of the bucket in the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, and there was water in the bucket. "Is this enough?" she asked, carrying it in. "Just about," Miss Honey said. "I don't suppose you'd ever done it before." "Never," Matilda said. "It's fun. How do you get enough water for your bath?" "I don't take a bath," Miss Honey said. "I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water and heat it on this little stove, and I strip it and wash myself all over." "Do you honestly do that?" Matilda asked. "Of course I do," Miss Honey said. "Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago. And they did not have a Primus. They had to heat the water of the fire in the hearth." "Are you poor, Miss Honey?" "Yes," Miss Honey said. "Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it?" The Primus was roaring away with powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves in it to it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then from a plastic container she took some margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray on it, and she put 2 mugs, the teapot, and a half bottle of milk, and a plate of the 2 slices of bread. "I'm afraid I don't have any sugar," she said. "I never use it." "That's all right," Miss Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. "Let's have it in the sitting room," Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading the way out of the kitchen and down to the dark little hard tunnel into the room at the front. Matilda followed her, and just beside the doorway of the so-called sitting room, she stopped and stared around her in absolute amazement. The room was small and square and bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came from a single tiny window in the front wall, and there was no curtains. The only object in the entire room was 2 upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs, and a third box between them for a table. And was all. There was no pictures on the walls, no carpet on the floor, only rough unpolished wooden planks, and there were gaps between the planks where dust and bits of grime had gathered. The ceiling was so low that the walls were white, but the whiteness that with a jump, Matilda could nearly touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, but the whiteness didn't look like paint. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and a white powder came out of her skin. It was whitewash, the cheap stuff that is used in cowsheds and stables and hen houses. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed school teacher lived? Was this all she had to come back after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what's the reason for it? There was something very strange going on around here, surely. Miss Honey put the tray on one of the cupboard boxes. "Sit down, my dear, sit down," she said, "and we'll have a nice hot cup of tea. Help yourself to bread. Both slices are for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good tuck-in at the school lunch, and that keeps me going until the next morning." Matilda perched herself carefully on the upturned box, and more out of politeness than anything else, she took a slice of bread and margarine and started to eat it. And home she would have been having buttered toast with strawberry jam, and probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off. But yet this was somehow far more fun. There was mystery here in this house, a great mystery, and there was no doubt about it, and Matilda was longing to find out what it was. Miss Honey poured the tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared not in the least ill, sitting in the upturned box in the bare room and drinking tea out of a mug that she balanced on her knee. "You know," she said, "I've been drinking very hard about what you did with the glass. It is a great power you have given my child. You know that." "Yes, Miss Honey, I do," Matilda said, chewing her bread and margarine. "So far as I know," Miss Honey went on, "nobody else in the history of the world has been able to compel an object to move without touching it or blowing it on or using any outside help at all." Matilda nodded but said nothing. "The fantastic thing," Miss Honey said, "would be to find out the real limit of this power of yours. Oh, I know you think you can move just about anything there is, but I have my doubts about it." "I'd love to try something really huge," Matilda said. "What about distance?" Miss Honey asked. "Would you always have to close thing when you have pushing?" "I simply don't know," Matilda said, "but it would be fun to find out."